So let me get rid of this window and that window, and then we will talk about what happens after the battle. So on Wednesday, we kind of got it all the way to the point where Lee surrendered, and as a result basically folded the whole Confederate effort, and we got all the way into Texas where the last battle happened. So really the battle part of our story is over, but we're going to backtrack just a little bit because there's been some stuff going on this whole time that has been affecting the way that people look at the war in the North. One of them is that there's massive splintering of the parties. Y'all remember that I told you that there was a general that was originally in charge of the Union forces, McClellan, who was an old world Virginian or old world Massachusetts person who was highly respected Lee and loved Jeb Stuart and hated Grant. You remember him? The one that always, you know, parked his army and then didn't attack and then got fired for not being aggressive enough. He decides to run against Abraham Lincoln in the presidential election. For Abraham Lincoln's second term. Lincoln was elected in 1860. McClellan decides to run against him in 1864. So all of the parties split. The Republicans split into moderate Republicans and radical Republicans. Radical Republicans build almost their whole platform on what is going to happen to the slaves after the war. Radical Republicans don't just want slavery abolished, they want universal male suffrage. They want men of every race to be able to vote. Okay, some radical Republicans also want to extend the vote to women, but mostly their focus is on freeing and then citizenizing all of the black people of the country. Moderate Republicans just want to abolish slavery and then, you know, work from there. Democrats are also splitting into two different parties. The Northern Democrats do support, some of the Union Democrats do support continuing to go to war because they buy into this whole idea that the South is just being held hostage and that, you know, they need to bring their country back together. But there is also a large faction of Democrats who believe that the war is stupid. They should cut it off. They should let the Confederacy flounder on its own as its own country and stop sacrificing troops to this endeavor because it's never gonna end. So we have all of this splintering of parties that's going on in the lead up to the election of 1864. Now, the end of the war happens in 1865, but there's a whole presidential election in 1864. Here's a cartoon that kind of shows how the parties view themselves, probably done by a Northern Republican-leaning paper, but these are all the different factions of the Republican Party, and they're basically Sumner. Grant is a radical Republican, Charles Sumner. Grant, of course, is a general, and then Farragut is a moderate Republican, but they're all holding up Abraham Lincoln and bolstering him. They're all like lockstep behind him. Meanwhile, McClellan is running as a Northern Democrat, and his platform is based on everybody having a different idea of what needs to happen next. And this cartoon sort of illustrates that he doesn't think that his position is very stable, because instead of being on a nice solid platform, he's basically on a wheel of cheese. So as a result of that, Lincoln wins the election by a landslide in 1864. Now, y'all remember that we studied the inaugural address in 1860? And what was one of the things that he said in his inaugural address about slavery? Y'all remember? Yeah, he's not so much, you know, he's not interested in ending slavery. That's not where his focus is. He doesn't really, that's not important to him. That's his inaugural address in 1860. This is a piece of his inaugural address in 1864, after he's won his second term as president. Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray that this mighty scourge of war may pass speedily away. In other words, we all hope this war ends very quickly. However, yet, if God wills that it continue until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword. Okay, so if God wills it, then we will let this war continue until slavery is ended, until every drop of blood drawn with a lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword. Abraham Lincoln is not even pretending anymore to be moderate about his anti-slavery position. Now, whether or not he does that as a way, because by this point, he's rallying black troops into regiments. So it's possible that his whole war rhetoric may have shifted in order to accommodate the fact that to recruit the almost 300,000 black troops that are going to go to war, they have to have an anti-slavery rhetoric. But actually, if you look at Abraham Lincoln's voting record, he never was he was always anti-slavery. He was just always, positioning about it. He was always like, you can't be radical and hold office. So he was always moderate before. He's not even pretending to be anymore. Now, of course, he won this election by a landslide, and the Confederate States didn't vote in it because they were no longer part of the Union, so they didn't vote in it. But he is the president in 1864, and Jefferson Davis is still the president of the Confederate States. And one of his in the run up to the election, one of the things that he does almost immediately after the Emancipation Proclamation is that he begins to support an amendment to the Constitution that will specifically outlaw slavery. Now, we talked about how the Emancipation Proclamation only ended slavery in the rebellious states, but it was always Lincoln's intention that it be abolished everywhere. And he has the support of some radical people in Congress to do that. And so he puts his support behind the people that are proposing an amendment to the Constitution. The Constitution at this point has not been amended since it was written. Okay? The first through 12th amendments all happened in 1797. The first through 10th were the Bill of Rights. The 11th established the ability of, made it impossible for individuals to sue state governments in the federal court. So it separated the state courts from the federal courts. And the 12th Amendment, what did the 12th Amendment do? I don't even remember off the top of my head, but it was established in 1797. So it was right off the bat. It wasn't one of the Bill of Rights for individuals. It was something for the government. I'll have to look it up. But anyway, nobody has tried to amend the Constitution since it was written, basically. They have something in there. Oh, I remember. The 12th Amendment establishes the Electoral College. That's right. Okay. Huh. I knew it was in there somewhere. So they had to do their first election. So obviously that was their first, that was before. This is the first time they've tried to amend the Constitution, but it does say in the Constitution how to do that. You have to pass the amendment through the Senate by a 2/3 majority. You have to pass it through the House by a 2/3 majority. And then 2/3 of the states have to ratify it, have to agree to it. Okay, so when half of your states might not be part of your country anymore, that becomes more difficult because, do they have to do it by a 2/3 majority of the states that aren't in the Confederacy, or do they have to include the Confederacy in that? It's really hard to tell. Let's just see what happens. So before the presidential election, it passes by the Senate. It passes by the Senate in 1864, in April of 1864. Then it goes to the House. It has overwhelming support in the Senate, but in the House, it's really, really split. And a lot of the people in the House are running for office, so they don't want to do anything really radical. So it doesn't pass in the House in June. A lot of people don't want to do anything any radical in an election year. Then the election happens in November. Abraham Lincoln gets reelected. His party gets reelected. A lot of the House seats go to people who are, part of his party. And so it gets reintroduced in the House in the beginning of 1865, and it is a nasty fight. And Lincoln goes person for person. Let's see, do I have that in here somewhere? Yeah, okay, so there's this movie called Lincoln in which Daniel Day-Lewis plays Abraham Lincoln that is about him going, basically, legislator by legislator, rallying support for the 13th Amendment, which says, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for the crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. Nobody will be enslaved or put in involuntary servitude unless they've been convicted of a crime. Why does that matter to us in the modern day? That part of it, unless they've been convicted of a crime. Anybody want to volunteer a comment on that?
I mean, that's where we get chain gangs.
Prison systems?
Yeah, the prison system makes use of this quite a bit. Yeah, the fact that this is the only way to impose involuntary servitude is by convicting somebody of a crime. But that's okay. We'll come back to that later. We'll come back to that in Reconstruction. It passes by, he fights personally. The radical Republicans have to make concessions because some of the people that don't want to vote for it don't want to vote for it because it doesn't go far enough. They don't want just an end to slavery. They want voting rights for former slaves, and they won't vote until they get that. And so it takes them a while to get the House of Representatives to pass it. But they do finally. In February of 1865, it finally passes the House. Okay, so in February of 1865, it passes the House. In April of 1865, the war comes to an end. So now we have to decide whether the states that are coming back are part of that 2/3 that has to ratify it. Okay, because now they're supposed to be coming back. Lincoln doesn't actually get to participate in that process because Lincoln is assassinated by John Wilkes Booth. Let's talk for just a minute about John Wilkes Booth. John Wilkes Booth was an actor. Okay, he was on the stage at the Ford Theater sometimes. So Abraham Lincoln was actually a fan. He actually had invited him to the White House as a guest several times, and he'd always turned him down. But from the beginning, Booth was planning on being a rebel. He was a member of the Knights of the Golden Circle, which was a secret society that wanted to start a new country, a pro-slavery, separate from the Union country. Aaron Burr was involved and tangled up in that. He had a brother who was a really strong unionist that he threatened to kill. They like had one of those brother, sad brother relationships where they were like always in each other's faces. He was there when John Brown was executed. He was there in attendance at the execution. He watched it happen. He actually tried to kidnap Lincoln from a theater in 1864. He tried to kidnap Lincoln when he was on a train. And then he tried again in March of 1865. It was actually kind of funny the way it happened. His plan was to kidnap Lincoln when Lincoln went to go attend something at a theater. And John Wilkes Booth, was staying at the National Hotel in Washington, D.C. at the time. He left the hotel to go to the theater to kidnap Lincoln. And Lincoln did a special ceremony at the hotel and missed his engagement at the theater. So if he had just stayed at the hotel, he probably would have run into Lincoln, but because he went to go, anyway, nothing that he did ever seemed to work. John Wilkes Booth's attempts at kidnapping Lincoln. Yeah, I did actually. That was the Baltimore plan, and it wasn't Booth, but it was the Baltimore plan was carried out by Pinkerton, who also failed to kill Lincoln in 1861. So this has been going on for a while. On the night that he actually managed to do it, it was part of a plan in which he was going to shoot and kill Abraham Lincoln and then stab Ulysses S. Grant at the theater, while two other assassins attempted to kill the Secretary of State and the Vice President. That way, all of the people in line for office would be wiped out. And they would have to be, they would have to revamp this whole election thing because everybody that was in line would be wiped out. That was the plan. He crept up on the Booth. He knew the play by heart, so he planned to shoot Lincoln during a specific laugh moment after a funny line, and he did. He snuck up behind him and shot him in the back of the head. He didn't die immediately. And Booth had this plan whereby he was going to shoot him in the head, jump over the stage, jump over the balcony onto the stage, land with great triumph and say whatever it was he was going to say. People kind of think what he said was "Sic semper tyrannis," which means "thus always to tyrants." But he said it so fast because on his way out of the balcony, his spur got tangled up in the banner, and he ended up face planting onto the stage instead and limping away. And so when he shouted it, people were like, "Wait, what did he say?" And they thought he was part of the show at first. And then they heard the screaming coming from the booth and the "Stop that man!" And the orchestra leader jumped onto the stage and tried to stop him, and he got away. The other two, Secretary of State was stabbed, but he wasn't mortally stabbed. He survived. And Vice President Johnson's assassin got drunk and never showed up. So this didn't work out the way Booth would have liked. Booth ran and took cover in a barn, Garrett's farm. He took cover in a barn. Federal troops surrounded him. And when he refused, "I will not come out," they set fire to the barn. So, I mean, he was eventually, and then he was shot through the burning wood and came out bleeding to death and then died. So none of this went the way Booth would have liked it. In the early hours of the next morning, Lincoln died. And this is a famous painting of Lincoln's deathbed that is incredibly inaccurate. But if you go face for face of each one of these people, they're all famous people that would have mattered to people at the time. You know, this is Charles Sumner. Thaddeus Stevens is here. Mary Lincoln is, you know, is draped over him, but all of these people are famous people that would have, you know, mattered to anybody that saw this painting. But honestly, it was just a couple of people with Lincoln when he died. It's widely agreed last words took place in the booth, in the balcony, and then it was something he said to his wife, that he had no last words after this. He didn't have any deathbed words or anything, that he was unconscious for this whole thing. Also, I've been informed by one of the psych professors here that we have Lincoln to thank for embalming in America, because they were going to travel his body across from one place to another. Yeah.
Because they took him on a parade.
Since they were going to put his body on a parade, they had to like perfect the art of embalming so that they could preserve his body long enough to survive the parade, and that's why we have embalming.
I mean, would you want to go see a rotting corpse of the guy that you're supposed to be the hero?
Jordan, would you want to go see a rotting corpse? Because it's okay to say so. We know about cannibalism.
I've been to the body exhibit, though.
Okay, so anyway, we have Lincoln's parade to thank for the fact that people know how to embalm bodies and keep them for several days for a funeral now. Anyway, that night or the next day, Andrew Johnson, the vice president, who had been stabbed but was okay, or he wasn't the one who was stabbed. Secretary of State was stabbed. Whose assassin had not shown up, was sworn in as the new president. He took a couple of actions right away. One of them was to offer $100,000 reward in those days. $100,000 in those days, reward for the capture of the fleeing President Jefferson Davis, who was eventually caught, as we talked about the other day. Okay, are y'all looking at this chat? Okay, Jordan, you're special. The as you heard, he fled in his wife's cloak, but actually the real issue was after his armies had surrendered, a lot of his support had kind of eroded, and his own men were sort of turning him in at that point. So he was arrested and tried. So the question becomes then, what do we do with the rebels and what do we do with the former slaves? And this was supposed to be something that Lincoln was going to address during his, next term in office. He was going to spend the next 4 years putting the Union back together and have the full support of the Republican Party in doing it, because he was like the one on their platform. But now it's Andrew Johnson who's on that platform, and he doesn't have the same kind of support because he himself is a moderate Republican. So the question becomes, what do we do with him? Lincoln had written a plan in 1863 when the Confederacy had started to lose battles after Gettysburg. He had written a plan for how to let the states back in. He said 10% of the voters in any given state had to take an oath of allegiance and agree to abide by emancipation. This was before he had managed to get the 13th Amendment to start, moving through the Senate and the House. But they couldn't come back unless they were going to agree to the Emancipation Proclamation. Radical Republicans didn't feel like that was enough. 10% of the population wasn't enough people. It should be a gross majority of them. So radical Republicans proposed what's called the Wade-Davis Plan. And the Wade-Davis Plan required a majority of voters, at least 51%, to take this oath. And I'm just going to read it to you as fast as I can. I do solemnly swear that I have never voluntarily borne arms against the United States since I've been a citizen thereof, that I have voluntarily given no aid, countenance, counsel, or encouragement to persons engaged in armed hostility thereto, that I have never sought nor accepted nor attempted to exercise the functions of any office whatever under any authority or pretended authority in hostility to the United States. So that rules out who? That rules out anybody that holds office, anybody that is a Confederate soldier, anybody that is the wife of a Confederate soldier, anybody that provided food to the Confederates, weapons to the Confederate soldiers, or stood there as they paraded and cheered them as they went by. You have to take an oath swearing that you never did any of those things during the whole war, that you never once, cheered for the Confederacy, for the Confederate soldiers as they went by. I do further swear that to the best of my knowledge and ability, I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. I will bear, this is actually part of an oath that a lot of people swear. In order for this to happen, in order for you to be a voter, you have to be willing to take this oath in order to be a voter in the southern states. It passed in the House and the Senate, but it was pocket vetoed by Lincoln. Do y'all know what a pocket veto is? Yeah, okay, so presidents have several different ways that they can veto a bill. If it comes to the desk for their signature, they can either stamp veto on it, or they can just tuck it in a drawer and not sign it. And eventually the House and the Senate together have to vote to override that and force it, even though it doesn't have the president's signature on it. That's what Lincoln had done. He had pocket vetoed it. Because at that point, they weren't sure what condition the South was going to be in when they did want to come back. If they did want to come back, they didn't know, and he didn't believe that it was smart to force this to be this would encourage them to stay gone, basically. This particular, the Wade Davis plan would encourage the Confederate States to fight to the death, basically, if this was how they had to come back. Johnson, who didn't know he was going to take office, he orders the southern states. He issues a plan while Congress is out of session. He does it by executive order, and he basically says every state that wants to come back has to hold new elections, and they have to reform their government so that they're more, abolition friendly. That way we can all come back to the table. So let's just put this whole big ugly mess behind us. Y'all make sure to reform and have, get rid of all your secession paperwork and just come back and remember that you're part of a union where we don't have slaves anymore, okay? How do you think that's going to work out in some of those southern states? Yeah, what is he? I mean, he gives them all kinds of latitude here to reform their governments, but doesn't give them really a whole lot of guidance. So this is technically the end of slavery, okay? Because as they come back, the states do ratify. Yeah, lots and lots of loopholes. Lots of loopholes. They do technically ratify the 13th Amendment. Emancipation Proclamation reaches Texas in 1865 in June. So if you're looking at this time here, let me go back to it. Okay. So the House and the Senate and the House both pass the 13th Amendment by February of 1865. But the Emancipation Proclamation doesn't reach Texas until June of 1865. And the states ratified it as they came back in. So it's not fully ratified until December of 1865. So technically slavery ends in all the southern states by June, but it's not codified in the law until December. And during that time in between June and December, the states have a responsibility to reform their constitutions with anti-slavery laws and stuff. And in some of those states, they do it by implementing what are called black codes. Are y'all familiar with the black codes? Okay, so this is a time.
Precursor to Jim Crow.
Actually, no, but I'll come back to that in a minute. This is a timetable of when the states ratified it, when they voted to approve it. So immediately in 1866 or 1868, states that rejected it and then accepted it by 1868, those. These are the ones that, eventually, and actually some of these states didn't actually ratify it until 1976. But it didn't matter because 2/3 of the states had already ratified it, okay? 1959, California didn't ratify it until 1959. That's crazy. But you don't need all of them to ratify it. You just need 2/3 of them to ratify it. So Lincoln had established this bureau before his death as part of the Department of War. Oh, I don't know. That's a good question. Arkansas? No, Arkansas ratified it in 1868. I know, it's shocking. Lincoln had established this, so I want you to remember this as part of a rolling plan. The Emancipation Proclamation goes into effect, which causes all kinds of economic ripple effects in the South. Then he sends people whose job it is to work with freed slaves and get them on their feet, network them together, get them into schools, provide them with education, provide them with job support, all that kind of stuff. And those march with the Union Army into places that are being occupied, okay? So the Freedmen's Bureau starts off as a war department. It's like in kind of the same way, I guess, not the Red Cross so much, but as a support unit that goes in right after a war and then helps to rebuild right after the war. And I want to tell you a funny story about that. Y'all remember me mentioning that when the Union started to have officers, black regiments, they didn't have any black officers until they allowed the chaplains to become officers. So I want to tell you a story about something that happened in a town in Virginia. A black regiment marched into a town in Virginia with 2 black chaplains, because it was 2 different regiments that marched in time for Easter Sunday. And they marched into this town. The Union forces occupied the town. And what they found in this town was this great, big, beautiful church that had been built by the black community in that town, by freedmen and working slaves that were still slaves. They had pulled their efforts together, and with the permission of the town and a freedman's contribution of his land that he owned, they had managed to build this big, beautiful church in the middle of this town. And the white population had looked at the church and gone, that's really nice. We're going to take this, and this is going to be our church now. You guys can still meet here, but you can only do it with a white pastor in charge, and you can only have your meetings in the basement because we're going to take the main sanctuary. Okay, then about a couple of years later, the Union troops marched in and occupied the town. And one of the first things that they found was this church where this had happened, where several years before, the black community had pulled together to build this big church and then had it seized from them. They announced that they were going to have Easter services in this great big church, that largely those Easter services would be given for these 2 great big black regiments that were marching in. And the chaplains informed the white pastors that we're going to hold our regimental Easter services in this building. And they said, oh, we don't let people do that. You have to meet in the basement. And so he said, yeah, we've actually seized this building at this point. So what we're going to do is we're going to take it away from you, and we're going to give it back to the black population of the city. And this is now their church. And the white population was like, you can't do that. And they were like, yes, we can. We're the Union troops. We're occupying your town. We're seizing this property, and this is how we're going to, and the Freedmen's Bureau was a part of that. Like, yeah, we're going to need this property in order to, implement some of the work we do here. That church, the white congregation of that church moved across town and tried to build their own church, but all the labor that they would have used to build their church was in the black community. So it took them like 10 years to build a church. The church that they built, the black church that was still there in the 1960s, was a place where Martin Luther King spoke, where civil rights actions rallied. It became a headquarters for civil rights activism and stayed one until they had to build a new campus because the old church wasn't big enough anymore. So they basically sold it and built a bigger campus, but it's still the same church. So this is part of how the Freedmen's Bureau was a war department. When they came into a town and liberated the black population in that town, and then set them up with their own community and allowed them to, put down roots and actually have strength behind what they were doing. That was an act of war against the Confederacy. After the Confederacy is no longer fighting, the Freedmen's Bureau is able to concentrate more on long-term plans, like educating children, like building out, reuniting families and stuff like that. And that's when Confederate troops who are resentful and angry start to target the Freedmen's Bureau, because it took these acts that they considered acts of war during the war, and now they're moving into every town and basically liberating the whole black population and enabling them and empowering them. And they're just, everywhere they go, they're in the way. So the Freedmen's Bureau gets targeted quite a lot by resentful Southern populations. But part of the reason for that is because they came in as an act of war to, prevent, after the Union troops leave, to prevent the Confederacy from taking back the black population and putting it back to work. So Congress renewed the charter for the Freedmen's Bureau, but Johnson vetoed it because of the way that it was structured. So we have officially, according to the 13th Amendment, we have officially stopped all slavery, but the implementation of that has been sort of left up to the states. The Freedmen's Bureau has moved in, but the Freedmen's Bureau has also lost power. So what do we have to look forward to in the next 10 to 20 to 30 years in these southern states? It should be on your screen. I mean,
Lots of segregation, lots of violence. Lots
Yeah.
of burning crosses.
Yeah, there's a lot of, and we should be clear that that wasn't something that was just happening in the South. A lot of the lynchings that happened in the second part of this 1800s also happened in the North, Indiana, Illinois, Chicago, outside of Chicago, lots of lynching. But the 14th Amendment will grant universal suffrage to all men, regardless of their race. So all men will be able to vote. And as soon as that happens, all of those attempts to reform constitutions in the southern states are now subject to the approval of voters for whom they don't serve. The black codes, yeah, I know, there are towns where it's actually gotten worse. The black codes were implemented in those southern states to give guidance to these newly free slaves about how they could behave in order to not get in trouble. So the black codes included things like, if you're walking on a sidewalk, if you're a black man walking on a sidewalk and a white person is walking towards you, you have to step off into the grass to let them pass you. If you can be punished if you look directly at or speak directly to a white female. But the biggest one probably is this one, and that is the idleness clauses. Okay, so if you are a black man, you can actually be thrown in jail for looking like you're not working. So if you don't want to go to jail, where you will be forced to work as part of, forced labor using chain gangs in the prison system. If you don't want to go to jail and be forced to work, then you have to find a job. And since you have to find a job, you're going to get paid the least possible amount. And if you don't, then you can actually be forced to work without getting paid. So idleness laws inside the black codes actually made it possible for people to, so like if you imagine yourself as a cotton plantation owner in Southeast Texas or Northwest Louisiana, in this area, in other words, and you have lost your entire labor force because they're no longer slaves, you can still go into the town and see your former slaves. And if it looks like they're just sitting there not doing anything, you can threaten to have them thrown in jail if they don't come back and work on your cotton plantation again. So did we really end slavery at this point? Has slavery actually ended at this point? Yeah, and what Jordan was talking about earlier, I think it was Jordan and possibly also Andrew, I don't know because I didn't see who was talking, is that since most of the prison systems in the southern states are for-profit prison systems, they rent out the labor of the prison system.
Bowie County is that way.
Yeah, Bowie County is all for-profit prisons.
The national news about it.
Yeah, yay for us being famous for something. Anyway, contracts are sold to prison systems, which then need to fill those contracts with labor. And what you need in order to fill labor through a prison system is for people to get convicted. And so the easiest way to convict them is to make something that they do very regularly illegal. And so what is it that becomes illegal very quickly? That wasn't illegal before this? Anybody want to guess?
Weed.
That's correct. Yes, Jordan's got it. Weed.
I was about to say that. I thought about that, but I didn't want to say it to everybody.
You didn't want to say it out loud. You knew, you just didn't want to say. Yes, marijuana becomes illegal because, did it become illegal because they needed labor for the free labor forces for the for-profit prisons, or because somebody actually believed that it was every bit as dangerous as heroin? I'll leave you to ask that question of yourselves.